Well, we were looking for a place that would have more community, more sense of community than we were finding in the city. We're looking for an apartment. And I knew about the housing center from having grown up in Oak Park. And so we gave them a call, and they referred us to a number of different places, which is how we found kind of the place and decided this is where we really wanted to end up kind of staying.
We moved in from Chicago to Oak Park. We looked at a lot of different places. We really appreciated the diversity of Oak Park.
This is one of the few places, not just in the Chicago area, but in the country where people are really grappling with this thing called diversity.
The schools are really well integrated, and I feel like the people here are very open-minded.
We're looking for a place that was diverse and that had a good number of progressive people.
One of the things that brought us here was that we were planning to have children, and that we felt that here there would be children who were like our children, that is, biracial. So it was important for us that our kids have peers like themselves.
More than 30 years after the passing of the Fair Housing Ordinance, Oak Park stands as a model of racial diversity. Today, residents flock to the village for its rich architectural heritage, quality schools, convenient access to Chicago, and of course, its diverse cultural environment. But diversity was not always present in Oak Park. In the 1960s, as America was struggling with the issue of civil rights, Oak Park was still a predominantly white suburb, and yet just across its southeastern border, Chicago's Austin neighborhood was experiencing rapid racial change. Residents of Oak Park were concerned that the tide of racial change would continue west from Austin and sweep through Oak Park. Sociologist and author Carol Goodwin.
Oak Parkers saw block by block in Chicago, black families moved in, white families moved out. This was accompanied by things like panic peddling and redlining and these kind of unscrupulous real estate practices. And the prevailing view was that suburban boundaries were arbitrary, that the metropolitan area was carved up into a lot of little patchworks of suburbs and communities, but they were really arbitrary political boundaries, and the forces that operated in the urban area, like resegregation, the boundaries were irrelevant.
I think that, in the late 60s, Oak Parkers, who were many of them, had moved here from the west side of Chicago. I mean, it was sort of a natural progression anyway. You moved up in the world, you moved to suburbia. But many of them watched what was happening to their old neighborhoods, to their grandparents' old neighborhoods, their parents' old neighborhoods, but certainly they could just look across the border and see what was happening in the city. And they saw the blockbusting by the realtors that was so blatant. They saw just redlining by the banks. I mean, there were a lot of people making money, but they weren't the people who lived there. They weren't the people who gave up their homes.
Well, when I walked down the street, people would look out their windows and stare at you. When you drove your car throughout Oak Park, people on their front porches would all turn and stare if you were a black couple. It was that rare. Children would stop playing and look and follow the car as you went down, and they would worry that maybe you were going to move into some house somewhere. That was very, very obvious. When I walked my little kids with the stroller, people would say, "Oh, so you're some of the people moving in," or make a comment, and I'd say, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" and keep moving.
Fair Housing Ordinance was specifically established to ensure that people would have equal and open access to housing regardless of race, religion, sex, or national origin. It was an effort to ensure that there would be a local mechanism by which to ensure that people had equal access without race as a factor. Unfortunately, many of the policies, be it banking, be it finance, be it insurance, were geared in many ways against the facilitation of an integrated community. So if we were going to be integrated and not simply have the block-by-block racial resegregation that was historically the pattern in Chicago, we had to be proactive. And the village trustees, along with the community, were prepared and willing to do that.
Although many white residents were fearful, the grassroots effort had begun. Oak Park would face the issue directly, redefine itself, and attempt to do what no other community had ever done before: generate a strategy for long-term integration. publisher of the Wednesday Journal, Dan Haley.
There were a lot of good people involved, and I think one of the things that was so exciting about those times is that there was truly a grassroots citizen response and demands, and that it led to things directly like the housing center. And then it was taken up by the leadership of the village government and some very fine board members in that era. You could see it in the schools. The realtors, I think to everyone's surprise, came around to be a positive force and played a critical role in all of this. So I think there were a lot of genuine leaders in that era.
It was a very nervous time for realtors, and I'm sure nervous time for the village of Oak Park. At some point, probably early 70s, is when the realtors, in conjunction with the village of Oak Park and the housing center, decided maybe it was time that we work together. That we met with the manager, village manager at the time, and the first chairperson of the community relations department, just to discuss, okay, we're all here, we love the community, we want to stay here, we want to have it thrive. And we said, we, the realtors, after some discussion, it was not an easy one, we said we agree to remove the for sale signs. And about the same time as that was done, there was a Supreme Court decision that came down that says a sign ban is illegal. The village of Oak Park and the real estate board said, we believe in the ban on signs. We had seen it working.
Now with the full support of the real estate community, the village took another bold step and launched the legendary Equity Assurance Program. Former Community Relations Director Sherilyn Reed.
Well, Equity Assurance was a program that was to guarantee people's property values regardless of who lived in the community. And it was kind of, I call it a security blanket. If you were concerned about that, you could take out Equity Assurance. Now, it was passed in '77. We've never had to use it and never intended to use it even at the beginning, because it was strictly to ease people's concerns and fears.
What it did is the publicity of Equity Assurance made people believe it would be safe. The image that the community, I have customers today who walk in and say, oh, you have that program that guarantees my house. They don't know anything about the town or anything about Equity Assurance, but they think it's guaranteed.
In an effort to upgrade Oak Park's aging housing stock, the village trustees organized the Residents Corporation in 1966. Frank Mariella was the group's first chief executive officer.
We would get as much information as we could from the owners of houses, and we had architects who were volunteering their time to come in and make inspections of the property and to make suggestions as to what they could do. It was the Residents Corporation job is to help them get it financed. So we stumbled on a rather unique way of doing that, in that we went to the existing lender and we said, look, we need X number of dollars, maybe $5,000 or $10,000, whatever the amount was, to finance these rehabilitating improvements that the architect has suggested and the people want. But we don't want you to raise their monthly payment. The effect was that the lender advanced the money and then lengthened the term of the loan so that the payment stayed the same, and all of a sudden these people had rehabilitated houses. The village had an initial bond issue, which they called the housing bond loan, and I think it's still referred to in that sense. This fund was available to any new property owner, any existing property owner who desired to borrow money at below market interest rates and rehabilitate their properties. Those grants were they just came right out of the general fund, and they were given to people who would improve the entranceway to their apartment building. So the village was very, very good. They realized their job was to provide funding. It was our job to put the funds into action.
They voted in favor on May 1st, 1972, of having the housing center come in.
The Oak Park Housing Center was the brainchild of Bobby Raymond, who was and still is a powerful and influential force in Oak Park. The housing center marketed the diverse neighborhoods of Oak Park to whites, encouraged African Americans to evaluate white neighborhoods, and made certain the Fair Housing Ordinance would be upheld. Board President Barry Greenwald.
We wanted to expand the options of people coming in so that if a white person came into town and might say, well, I don't want to live east of Ridgeland, which some people said, the housing center would encourage them to look at apartments east of Ridgeland. And if an African American came into the community, they would be essentially given referrals for apartments in other parts of the village, so that people were essentially given options that they hadn't thought about before. The housing center has worked very, very hard to make sure that within the rental community there is no racially identifiable area. Integration is not where there's pockets of blacks and pockets of whites. Oak Park's strategy was to say there weren't going to be pockets like that.
The significance of moving the village hall to the southeast section of the village was in response to a number of issues. One, it cleared a square block of some modest housing that stood the need of significant redevelopment. It brought the village in a major multi-million-dollar investment in the neighborhood, saying to the people in that surrounding area, the village hall is here, and from this space will a lot of services emanate. A third factor, though, was the fact that that also included the police station. And that meant that there'd be a significant police presence in the area, which was by the neighbors seen to be a positive.
And I think that the ordinances that set up loans and grants to apartment owners was pretty significant. It gave them money to renovate, for one thing, but it also tied them to saying, you've got to keep a balanced population. In these units, if you don't want to keep a balanced population, then don't ask us for money. But if we're willing to help, if you're willing to do this, there were a whole series of related ordinances tied to improving the situation for the multifamily.
Other things like emphasis on the east side. We beefed up police patrols. We wanted to answer the question that it's not safe. We wanted to have Austin Boulevard a showpiece. The previous board had put those cul-de-sacs in, so it wasn't easy to come in and out without going through the preferential street. And that opened up parking possibilities, which made apartments on Austin more saleable.
The gateway projects in the commercial areas at Chicago, Madison, and so on were sincere efforts by the village to try to say this is the front door to the village. I think you can look at the Harrison Street neighborhood as a vital success in terms of building an arts community there. The village has actually purchased property at Chicago and Austin and helped maintain that area. But certainly it was done in reaction to and as part and parcel of the effort to have a comprehensive response to the integration issue.
When I arrived in Oak Park in 1975, we were starting the school reorganization. And I volunteered to be on the committee. There was community people, educators, parents, and students were not involved in a formal way, but their input was always welcome. That, that's the way Oak Park works. The plan was that we would have 2 junior high schools. Previously Hawthorne, which is now Percy Julian, was 1 junior high school, and Emerson, which all of these were K's, Emerson became the other junior high school. And then the feeder schools all fed into those 2 junior high schools, which made for a real racial balance. Even if classrooms weren't necessarily always balanced, these 2 schools, all of the students would eventually feed into those 2 schools. We have a human dignity and cultural pluralism policy at our school district from the board level where it needs to be. But when you ask people to teach multiculturally, they need to be supported. So we have this multicultural resource center with resources from all over the world so that when teachers are teaching in a multicultural way, they can come and check out materials from our Multicultural Resource Center. And at this point, our collection is about 9,000. This is artifacts, books, videotapes from all over the world, and a teacher can come in there. And that was all designed to support this idea of diversity and saying in Oak Park we celebrate diversity and we celebrate multicultural education, and we're asking you to make every minute of every day a multicultural experience, and this is what we'll do to help support that idea.
The policy statement on diversity was essentially symbolic because policy statements don't make things happen necessarily. But you got to think about what those times were like. We had already passed the Civil Rights Act, that is a federal government, 7 years earlier, but people were tending to fight the whole concept of fair housing and why doesn't so-and-so live over here instead of here. So it was an invitation as well as a challenge. It said, this is the way this community is going to be.
Basically, with the passing of the Fair Housing Law, we felt it was really important to have a community relations function, have a department that would respond to people's concerns, either about houses that sold or about block activities or lack of it, or housing issues dealing with multiple family buildings, and reaching out to the people and giving the people an opportunity to respond, to have questions, to air complaints, because one of our functions is rumor control. And back in, used to be, that was really very heavy. And so having a place where people could bring those concerns and then work out some resolution to them, the Community Relations Department was a place where that could be done, and still is being done.
Although Oak Park has come a long way toward creating a diverse community, there are those that feel as if there's a lot more work left to be done.
I think that the balance within the schools racially is an important issue, and that there needs to be some fundamental racial balance among our schools. I don't believe the school district perceives that.
The schools have to be more aware of cultural differences. I think there are programs I have in my lap, something from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Teaching Tolerance has excellent programs that I'm not sure whether our schools are using.
What do you do about the rental people? I mean, there are people who just want to rent. What do you do about the older people who are out of single-family homes, who can't afford condominiums? So it's a balancing act.
I think it's unfortunate that some of the people who have been doing the condo conversions have made phenomenal profits out of these transitions. But what is the residual for the community? I think home ownership and property ownership is a positive. But are people going to have the skills and the ability and the insight to do the kind of maintenance of the property that is so essential, because that's an essential element of our tax base?
Every major institution in this community, local government, the religious community, the real estate community, the business community, the arts community, and in particular the school community, has to continually see whatever decisions they make through the prism of how does it impact diversity, how does it help this village to maintain that goal.
I think the future requires us to think regionally on this issue. Oak Park is not an island. We were not able to communicate much with Cicero, Berwyn, River Forest, Elmwood Park. That's got to change. We've got to work at this together. And regional approaches to the issue of racial diversity are where we've got to go.
Being involved with several committees over the years, I'd say that Oak Park has a wonderful image of being an integrated, participatory community, but that's not necessarily my experience. I think it has a long way to go and a lot of work to do to be more inclusive.
I think one of the issues now is how do we share power? How do we not only welcome different racial groups into this community, but how do we share power with them and not just say, well, it's fine, as you can come as long as you do everything the way we want it to be done, and the old guard does it. So now we have to step aside and invite these other groups to join us around the tables and at the boardrooms.
I think whenever anyone finds themselves in a position of no longer being a sizable majority, it makes them really question, what do I think about diversity? Diversity is very easy when you've got one or two people coming in, actually. It's much harder when you've got larger numbers of very different people coming in. And that's where we are, and I don't think we've really begun to address that sort of complex situation that we find ourselves in now in any real, appropriate, or adequate way.
As the 21st century begins, Oak Park is left with new decisions and new challenges. What strategies will be developed to maintain racial balance in the schools, in the neighborhoods, and in the power structure? Can today's Oak Park capture the spirit of the many people who pioneered the diversity movement? The answers to these questions will shape the future of families of Oak Park for generations to come.